back to another video. Today's video is about shipwrecks. The anniversary of the Edmund Fitzgerald sinking was last week, Monday, the 50-year anniversary. A lot of people know about the Edmund Fitzgerald because, well, there's a song that came out like a year after it sank. Very well-known song, and it's one of those stories that has stuck with people. However, it is not the only boat to sink on the Great Lakes. There are supposedly 6,000 shipwrecks across the entirety of the Great Lakes, which is insane. It is also not the only ship to split in two pieces. So today I'm going to be talking about 3 ships that sank on the Great Lakes that are quite similar in size and shape that split in two. The SS Carl D. Bradley. Bradley Transportation Company's fleet of self-unloading ships was used to haul limestone from the Michigan Limestone Quarry in Rogers City, Michigan. Carl D. Bradley was built in 1927 to meet Michigan Limestone's lucrative contract with a cement firm in Gary, Indiana. At 639 feet with a beam of 65 feet, she was the largest Great Lakes freighter and self-unloading freighter for 22 years until she was surpassed by the SS Wilfred Sykes, which was 678 feet long in 1949. The Bradley's registered port was New York City, but in reality its home was Rogers City. A lot of the people who worked on the Carl D. Bradley lived in Rogers City, as it went in and out of the city every few days, so it just made sense to live in town. Everyone there knew each other, friends, family, co-workers. It was like one big family. The Carl D. Bradley was not without incident. She had a collision with the MV White Rose on the St. Clair River on April 3rd, 1957. She was in dry dock in Chicago for quite a while in May to fix damages that were caused. She also grounded twice while leaving out of Cedarville, Michigan, one in the spring of 58 and one in November of 58. These groundings were not reported to the U.S. Coast Guard. They were repaired and sent back onto the waters. And since the company's opening in 1912, they had not lost one ship. Which brings us to November 18th. The Carl D. Bradley was scheduled for repairs in Manitowoc, Wisconsin. The company was planning to, while it was during its winter layup, to spend $800,000 on adding a new cargo hold and fixing rivets and replacing the rust that was clearly there. Crew often joked that the ship was held together by rust, and during bad storms, the boat would twist and turn, and rivets would actually pop out of the side of the walls, and they would collect them in buckets. Now, if I were on a boat and the rivets started popping like popcorn, I think I'd freak out a little bit. But a lot of men on these boats, this was their livelihood, and a lot of them would get a bonus at the end of the season, so they couldn't just upright and leave. They had to stick it out. The Coast Guard inspected the vessel in April of 1958 and said it was seaworthy. They did another safety test in October of 1958 with a fire drill and a boat drill and deemed the ship ready to go. On November 18th, the Carl D. Bradley was on its way to Rogers City. The day before, it dropped off its last shipment of the season of crushed stone in Gary, Indiana. After dropping off the stone in Indiana, they filled their ballast tanks with 9,000 US gallons of water to keep the boat steady as there was no cargo on board. They headed toward Manitowoc so they could lay up and get the fixes that they needed. When the ship was only an hour or two away, they got a call from their bosses saying that they were signed up to do one more trip to Rogers City to grab one more cargo of stone. The crew was so close to being done for the season, but they were asked to do one more. However, a storm was brewing over the lake. There were 25 to 35 mile-per-hour winds when the boat began its journey. However, a gale was forming over the Great Lakes. The winds rose to 50 to 65 miles per hour when two weather patterns merged into one another. Captain Roland Bryan was known as a heavy weather captain. These captains on the Great Lakes were willing to put their ships in danger most times, but you can't really blame them. When it came to shipping back then, the goal was to get their cargo and get it to the destination as quickly as humanly possible, and couldn't really complain because delays and problems would not make their bosses happy. Yes, safety was important, but it wasn't the main priority of anyone's boss. The goal was to get it to where it needed to be. On November 18th, Captain Brian avoided the brunt of the building seas by instead traveling 5 to 12 miles along the lee of the Wisconsin coast. He planned a course with his first and second mate that would take them to Canna Island, then turn at Lansing Shoal near the Beaver Island group. However, this captain was not without his doubts. He wrote a letter to a friend saying that he doubted the ship was seaworthy enough to be in bad storms, and he was really thankful that it was going to be fixed up by the end of the season. He just wanted to go home. She reduced her speed sometime before 4 p.m. to 14 to 15 miles per hour. By 4 p.m., she was past Poverty Island. Around 5:30, first mate Elmer Fleming contacted Calcite, which is where they were headed, to tell them that they would be in port around 2 in the morning. Very shortly after this call was made, a loud thud could be heard and a very rough vibration. The first mate turned aft and saw that the stern was sagging in a way that it should not sag. Captain Brian immediately sounded the alarm, told the engine room to stop the engines, and told his crew to get their life jackets on. The first mate managed to get out a mayday call with their position before the lines were cut. The distress call was picked up by the Coast Guard, commercial and non-commercial, land and sea radio operators. Elmer Fleming's account is harrowing. When he realized the boat was going down and that he didn't have a life jacket, he ran down to his stateroom 2 decks down with no lights. He grabbed his life jacket, and when he came back up to the deck of the pilot house, he saw the captain and a few others near the life raft. As he headed toward it, the bow sagged and he was thrown into the water. When he came to the surface, the forward section was gone. The aft section was going to port. The propeller was high in the air and started to go down. As it went down and the water hit the boilers, they exploded. And a giant bright flash of red, orange, yellow lit up the sky before the entire boat went under. The ship sank in minutes. The crew of the German cargo vessel Christian Satori saw this happen through binoculars. They saw the lights go out on the bow section with the other half still lit up. Then they saw those lights go out, and then they saw the explosion. After witnessing the explosion, the crew obviously were like, holy crap, we have to go help them. So they changed course to head directly to where they saw the explosion. However, due to the rough seas, their 4-mile distance took them an hour and a half. The Coast Guard cutter Sundew went out from Charlevoix, Michigan, into the open lake, and she arrived at the search area at 10:40 p.m., 5 hours after Carl D. Bradley sank. Coast Guard Station Charlevoix also launched a 36-foot motor lifeboat in an attempt to reach Carl D. Bradley, but this was ordered back after being mercilessly tossed about on Lake Michigan. The cutter Hollyhock from Sturgeon Bay arrived on the search scene at 1:30 on November 19th after a 7-hour trip that her skipper described as a visit to hell. Awesome. During the night, friends and family of the Carl D. Bradley heard of what was happening and traveled to Charlevoix to await, hopefully, the survivors' welcome. They knew that many of the life-saving boats had left from there, so they would return there. So they waited to see if their family would come home. A lot of them lined their cars up on the beach and actually lit their headlights up as like a beacon home. 8 other vessels also helped in the search, including aircraft. At 8:37 a.m. on November 19th, 15 hours and 17 miles away from the initial sinking site, the survivors were found. Only 2 survived the sinking. First mate Elmer H. Fleming, aged 43, and deck watchman Frank L. Mays, 26. Another crew member, deck watchman Gary Streleski, was found alive, but once they got him out of the water, he couldn't hold on anymore. The 2 survivors stated that they shot 2 of the 3 signal flares into the sky when the Christian Satori was close. However, the 3rd one wouldn't light as it was too wet. That one, mate might have saved them right away, as the Christian Satori was within 100 yards of them. But during the day, Sundew and other ships discovered 17 bodies, all in their life jackets. They were brought to Chevreau for identification. More life jackets were found floating in the water, laced up as if they were on someone and were pulled off of them. 15 bodies were never found. After the ice broke up in 1959, the United States Army Corps of Engineers located Carl D. Bradley's wreck using sonar equipment aboard MS Williams. The wreck was found 5 miles northwest of Boulder Reef, just south of Gull Island, lying at a depth of 360 to 370 feet. Later, in 1959, Carl D. Bradley's owners hired an exploration team to survey the wreck to see if it was in 2 pieces. Both survivors said it split up in half on the surface, and the company decided that that didn't fit the narrative that they wanted to tell, so they did an investigation and claimed that's not true, it's in 1 piece. They wanted to claim it was an act of God, that it wasn't their fault. The Coast Guard Marine Board found that the Carl D. Bradley sank because of hogging stresses. They concluded that Brian had poor judgment for going out into the lake during this storm. Now, I could see that. The storm is really bad. Going straight into it, for another load, I get it. But his boss told him to do this. It wasn't like he had a choice. I mean, he could have chosen to not do it, but you could lose your job doing something like that. And there could have been a safer way to get across, and maybe he made some mistakes, but you can't say it was all his fault. However, the commandant of the Coast Guard, Vice Admiral A.C. Richmond, issued his own point, and he disproved this. He was like, it's not his fault. Richmond noted that the boat was sailing smoothly before it snapped in half, and it had 31 years of being on the lakes, and yes, it had issues and storms, but it had never been too bad where they couldn't make it home. He concluded that it broke on the surface due to an undetected break or fracture or something wrong with the boat. What also didn't help is the type of steel used before 1948 is known to become brittle, whether it comes to temperature changes or in storms. It's not as good a steel that should be used for boats, and I believe there is a specific reason as to why this steel is quite brittle. But any boat built before 1948 has the risk of just cracking. Following the Carl D. Bradley sinking, some recommendations were made. Mechanical changes should be made in the way lifeboats are disengaged and deployed. A second life raft should be mandatory on Great Lakes cargo ships because they land upright no matter how they are overturned. Each lifeboat should be equipped with 2 tow ropes. 6 parachute-type flare signals with equipment for firing them skyward should be stored on each lifeboat and life raft. The cork and canvas life vest should be updated to include crotch straps and collars to support the neck, so they're unlikely to fly off of a person if a wave hits them. The company initially offered $660,000 in a settlement to the families. However, the families were not happy with that. The company, when they did their original survey claiming that it was an act of God and that was in 1 piece, they had no impartial judges. It was just them. They had no one that would think opposite of them. They all agreed with one another, so they were just trying to take the blame off of themselves. 10 families filed lawsuits ranging up to $7 million against the company. In the end, the company settled with a lump sum of $1.2 million a year and 16 days after the sinking. For many years, the conclusion that this company made, that it was in 1 piece, was believed. However, the survivors knew different. Jim Clary, marine author and artist, and Fred Shannon, maritime explorer, led 2 diving expeditions to the wreck with the goal of proving that the survivors' account was accurate. Survivor Frank Mays was able to go on both expeditions down to the wreck. The first expedition was in 1995 with a submersible. However, due to the conditions, they couldn't tell if it was in 2 pieces, so they went back down again. This time, they came back in 1997 with an ROV, and with the footage they were able to collect, it was shown that the Carl D. Bradley was in 2 pieces about 90 feet apart. So the entire time when the survivors were called crazy for saying that their boat was split in half by the company that they were, working for, this was like a moment that Mays had been waiting for a very long time. I saw it go down in 2 pieces on the surface, and now I've seen it in 2 pieces on the bottom of Lake Michigan. This is dedicated to the 33 men who lost their lives and the 2 men who survived and will never be the same. 8 years later, there was the SS Daniel J. Morrell. Daniel J. Morrell was built at West Bay City, Michigan by the West Bay City Shipbuilding Company for the Cambria Steamship Company, the Cambria Iron Company's marine subsidiary that they had formed earlier that year. The ship was launched on August 22, 1906. It was 609 feet long with a beam of 58 feet. Cambria chartered both the Daniel J. Morrell and her sister ship Edward Y. Townsend to sail for the M.A. Hanna Company, one of the most experienced vessel management firms on the lakes. They transported bulk cargo, so iron, coal, wood, like whatever needed to be transported across the Great Lakes, they were up for the challenge. As with the last story, this boat was on the last run of the season. It was on a route with its sister ship when it got caught in a gale. The winds rose to 70 miles per hour with waves up to 20 to 25 feet in height. In the early morning hours of November 29, 1966, the sister ship, Edward Y. Townsend, decided that it couldn't make it through the storm. The captain didn't want to risk it, so they decided to seek refuge in the St. Clair River. However, the Daniel J. Morrell decided to keep going. Luckily, there is a first-hand account from watchman Dennis Hale, and this is what happened next. I was asleep when I heard a hard thump. Books in his room tumbled to the floor. The lights blinked out. I thought the anchor was dropping. Then I heard the emergency alarm. I got dressed and ran topside. The ship was breaking in half. At 2 a.m., the ship began its death throes. Those on the bow section went to the life raft that they could easily get to. The crew on the bow section yelled out that a boat was heading toward them. However, it was just the stern section heading straight toward them. As we were floating out on this raft, we could see the 2 halves hitting each other. They had separated, and the back part still had power and kept ramming into the front part. She buckled, and she sank. About 15 minutes after we got on the raft, the ship went down. No distress call was transmitted. Captain Crawley stated that the cable had been severed by the time he even attempted to make a call. The men were instructed to shoot flares the second they got on the raft, hoping that anyone could see them. There were 4 who made it onto the raft, including Dennis. However, one by one, they dropped like flies. 2 of them went out in short procession. The 3rd held on a little longer, but he also succumbed to hypothermia, leaving Dennis on a raft with 3 of his crewmates dead. The Daniel J. Morrell was not reported missing until the following day on November 30th at 12:15 p.m. when it did not get to its destination. The U.S. Coast Guard issued a be on the lookout order and sent several vessels and aircraft to search for the missing vessel. At 1600 on November 30th, a helicopter spotted Dennis Hale, the lone survivor. He had survived 14 hours in the freezing cold with just boxers, a pea coat, and a life jacket. He may have survived, but he had to go through many surgeries after this, as I can't even imagine the damage to his body. The survey of the wreck found the bow section 220 feet below the surface and found the stern section 5 miles away. The clock read 3:28, which means possibly that the stern section traveled for an hour and a half by itself. Just imagine, if you will, a boat has just split in half. Now this is a 600-ish foot boat, so let's say it was an even split. 300 feet. A 300 section of boat is traveling by itself. There is no way to control it. It is just going. It goes for an hour and a half, which means that anyone who may have been stuck on that side of the ship had an extra hour and a half before it sank beneath them, which is actually crazy. And if I were on a boat and saw half of a boat just sail past me, I don't even know what I would do. That's a scary image. And just imagining being on that life raft and watching half your boat go into the fog, that's crazy. The Edward Y. Townsend, that had nearly escaped the same fate as its sister, was examined after the storm, and at first the damage didn't seem that bad. And then they took a closer look. There was a giant crack in the deck. If that ship had decided to do exactly what the Daniel J. Morrell had done, they too could have split in half. The boat was seen as a total loss and was spent 2 years just sitting there. Eventually it was decided to be sent to Europe to be scrapped. On October 7th, 1968, the boat was caught in a storm. The line snapped, the boat split in half, and landed not far from where the Titanic sits. The reasoning behind this tragedy was similar to the Carl D. Bradley. It was in November. November is known to be the worst month to sail on the Great Lakes. The storms are brutal. They can get 20 to 25 foot waves and sometimes have rogue waves up to 40 feet high. Winds can get up to hurricane level. They act like little baby oceans. It is well known that a lot of ships that have sunk in the Great Lakes have done in November, because November is it's the last month of the season before, it gets too cold, too icy to be able to travel through the Great Lakes, and it is literally the worst month to travel ever. The reason for the sinking was shown to be that the boat was built before 1948, which means the steel was more brittle and most likely snapped due to stress. Also, the weather was really, really bad. So a mix of both. Recommendations were made after the sinking, providing inflatable life rafts, emergency source of power for radio communication, and modifications to the general alarm system. Future Great Lakes bulk cargo vessels will be constructed with sufficient compartmentation so that the vessel can remain afloat even if any one of the main compartments is flooded. Evaluation of the need for tarpaulins on vessels equipped with secured sliding plate type hatch covers during all seasons when not carrying cargo. Providing the master of the Great Lakes bulk cargo vessel with a loading manual that would indicate the limiting longitudinal bending moment factor that his vessel can sustain. Vessels should be provided with a datum marker buoy in case radio is not working. On-scene sea conditions should be reported in regular marine weather broadcasts. The remains of 26 of the 28 lost crewmen were found. However, not all of them right away. Some of the bodies were found in May of the following year. The 2 men who were never found were declared legally dead in May of 1967. This is dedicated to the 28 men who went down with their ship. And the last ship that I'll be talking about today is the SS Edmund Fitzgerald. Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company of Milwaukee, Wisconsin invested in the iron and minerals industries on a large scale, including the construction of Edmund Fitzgerald, which represented the first such investment by any American life insurance company. In 1957, they contracted Great Lakes Engineering Works of River Rogue, Michigan, to design and construct the ship within a foot of the maximum length allowed for passage through the soon-to-be-completed St. Lawrence Seaway. The Edmund Fitzgerald was the longest ship on the Great Lakes, becoming the Queen of the Lakes until September 17, 1959, when the 730-foot SS Murray Bay was launched. The boat was launched on June 7, 1958. The boat was named after a company owner, the Edmund Fitzgerald. His wife tried to christen the ship with champagne, and it took her 3 tries to break the bottle, which sailors would say was bad luck. And then they struggled to loosen the ship because it went in sideways, so it kind of did a one of these. And they were struggling to get it loose. When it did come loose, it went a little too far and slammed into the other side, spraying people who were watching the ship. And I believe it destroyed a pier. And people who were there claimed that it looked like the boat was trying to climb onto land, which is an interesting term of phrase. The Edmund Fitzgerald was a record-setting workhorse. She did her job, and she did it well. She set many records, including seasonal records, 6 different times. For 17 years, she carried taconite pellets. Loading the Edmund Fitzgerald with taconite pellets took about 4.5 hours. However, unloading her took 14 hours. A round trip from Superior, Wisconsin to Detroit, Michigan took her 5 days, and she did this usually about 47 times a season. By November of 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald had logged 748 round trips across the Great Lakes and over 1 million miles traveled. It is estimated that it would equate to about 44 trips around the entire world. But the vessel was not without her problems. She ran aground in 1969 and collided with the SS Hochelaga in 1970. Later that same year, she got stuck in the lock and accidentally did this again in 1973 and 1974. On January 7th, 1974, she lost her original anchor in the Detroit River. However, none of these incidents were considered serious or out of the ordinary or bad luck, though I would consider them bad luck, but that's me. The Edmund Fitzgerald left Superior, Wisconsin at 2:15 p.m. on November 9th, 1975, under the watchful eye of Master Captain McSorley. Around 5 p.m., the Edmund Fitzgerald was joined by another cargo vessel manned by Captain Jesse Bernie Cooper, known as the Arthur M. Anderson, which was headed toward Gary, Indiana. The weather forecast was not far off from what was normal in November on the Great Lakes. However, it was stated that a gale would pass over Lake Superior, so it wouldn't hit them. The SS Wilfred Sykes was loaded opposite the Edmund Fitzgerald and left 2 hours after they did. In contrast to what the forecast was saying, the captain of the Wilfred Sykes felt like something bad was going to happen. A lot of sailors on the seas, when the forecasts weren't the most accurate, relied on their senses. And being on the seas for quite a long time, you could kind of tell when a storm was brewing. And he believed that one, a very bad one, was headed toward them. The Arthur M. Anderson and the Edmund Fitzgerald altered course northward to hug the banks of Ontario to try and shelter from the storm that had arrived at 1 in the morning on November 10th. At 2 a.m., the National Weather Service reported that the wind speeds were up to 58 miles per hour and that they were in a storm. Until then, the Edmund Fitzgerald had been following the Arthur M. Anderson. But the faster Edmund Fitzgerald pulled ahead of the Arthur M. Anderson at around 3 in the morning. As the storm center passed over the ships, the wind kind of died down. It, petered out, I wouldn't say completely, but calmed down. After 1:50 p.m., the Arthur M. Anderson logged wind speeds up to 50 miles per hour, and things were getting bad again. At 2:45, it began to snow, which made visibility just downright awful. Shortly after 3:30 p.m., the Edmund Fitzgerald radioed the Arthur M. Anderson that it had lost 2 hatch covers and a fence railing, and that they were taking on water. Shortly after 4:10 p.m., McSorley called the Anderson once again, saying that their radar was malfunctioning and asked if they could keep track of them on their radar. For a time, the Arthur M. Anderson did navigate the Edmund Fitzgerald toward the safety of Whitefish Bay. Around 4:40, the Arthur M. Anderson contacted the Coast Guard to see if the light and navigational beacon were on at Whitefish Bay. From what the Coast Guard was seeing, neither were operational, so the Arthur M. Anderson contacted a few boats in the area, received a response around 5:30 saying that the light was on. At approximately 7:10, the Arthur M. Anderson contacted the Edmund Fitzgerald to ask how they were doing. The Edmund Fitzgerald replied with, "We're holding our own." That is the last known communication from the Edmund Fitzgerald. No distress signal was received, and the Arthur M. Anderson, about 10 minutes later, lost the ability to see them at all. It was like they looked down and the Edmund Fitzgerald was there, and the next, there was nothing. Now, they were getting a lot of interference because the storm was just really, really bad, but the captain believed that they should have seen them, and they had been seeing them, and then suddenly they just weren't there. The captain of the Arthur M. Anderson first called the Coast Guard at 7:39, about 20-ish minutes after he last heard from the Edmund Fitzgerald. He contacted them on channel 16, which was the Mayday signal, like please help us signal, and they told him to call back on channel 12. The captain then contacted a ship in the area known as the Nafiri, and they could not pick up the Edmund Fitzgerald either. Despite repeated attempts to get the Coast Guard's attention, Cooper did not get someone to respond until 7:54 p.m. However, this didn't really do anything as they were calling for a different reason. At 8:25, he called the Coast Guard again, saying his concern about the Edmund Fitzgerald as he had not gotten a response from them in over an hour. He reported them missing after 9. Lacking the appropriate rescue vessels and the fact that the storm was so bad and a lot of the rescue vessels at stations, as stated in the other stories, are really small boats, they asked if the Arthur M. Anderson would go back into the lake to try and find the Edmund Fitzgerald itself, which there is a recording of this conversation, and you can tell that he is not real keen on doing this. Like, he's very nervous about this idea because obviously he made it through the storm, but that doesn't mean if he went back out, he could survive again. He was very concerned about his ship and the people on board. The Coast Guard did ask a few other ships in the area to try and help out, and a few did, but some of them refused because it just wasn't safe for their crews, and there's no point in going out into a storm to lose 2 boats instead of 1. The initial search for survivors was carried out by the Arthur M. Anderson and a second freighter, SS William Clay Ford. The efforts of a third freighter, the Toronto-registered SS Hilda Mary Marjane, were foiled by the weather. They did try to send out a few other vessels, and they did have an airplane in the air searching for anything of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Eventually, the search began finding debris. Lifeboats, pieces of material, but no people. On the final voyage, there were 29 men on board, mostly from Wisconsin and Ohio, ranging from ages 20 to 63. None of their bodies were found. A U.S. Navy Lockheed P-3 Orion aircraft piloted by Lieutenant George Connor found the wreck using its magnetic anomaly detector on November 14, 1975, in Canadian waters, close to the international boundary at a depth of 530 feet. Edmund Fitzgerald lies about 15 miles west of Deadman's Cove, Ontario, about 8 miles northwest of Pancake Bay Provincial Park, and 17 miles from the entrance to Whitefish Bay to the southeast. And found Edmund Fitzgerald lying in 2 large pieces. The bow section stood upright in the mud, some 170 feet from the stern section, that lay capsized at a 50-degree angle from the bow. In between the 2 broken sections lay a large mass of taconite pallets and scattered wreckage lying about, including hatch covers and hull plating. There have been several dives to the wreck since then. In 1980, during a Lake Superior research dive expedition, marine explorer Jean-Michel Cousteau sent 2 divers from RV Calypso in the first manned submersible dive to Edmund Fitzgerald. The dive was brief, and although the dive team drew no final conclusions, they speculated that Edmund Fitzgerald had broken up on the surface. There was another expedition in 1989. This group's goal was to kind of get footage for a documentary and to be used in museums. This expedition used a towed survey system and a free-swimming ROV. 5 hours of the footage was used in a documentary, and some of it was used for National Geographic. Frederick Stonehouse, who wrote one of the first books on the Edmund Fitzgerald, did a panel in 1990 reviewing this footage, and he could not come to a conclusion on how it broke either. Canadian explorer Joseph B. Macness organized and led 6 publicly funded dives to Edmund Fitzgerald over a 3-day period in 1994. Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institution provided Edwin a link as a support vessel and their manned submersible Celia. The Great Lakes Historical Society paid $10,000 for 3 of its members to come along on this expedition so it could take some pictures. This expedition also could not conclude exactly what caused this boat to sink. That same year, longtime sport diver Fred Shannon formed Deep Quest Ltd. And organized a privately funded dive to the wreck of Edmund Fitzgerald using submersible Delta. Deep Quest conducted 7 dives and took more than 42 hours of underwater video, while Shannon set the record for the longest submersible dive to Edmund Fitzgerald at 211 minutes. Now, this dive is very controversial because they actually found a crew member. Now, you would assume this happened in the 90s, that had been about, let's say, 20 years since it sank. You would assume there would be no bodies. However, Lake Superior is very deep and very cold, and bacteria cannot get down 500 some feet. It is super cold, no bacteria. Bodies don't deteriorate like they should, which means that it is possible that bodies can be in shipwrecks at the bottom of the lake. Now, I don't know the science, and I don't know how long bodies can last down there, and hopefully I never find out. but it is well known that Lake Superior doesn't give up her dead. He was still wearing his life jacket, meaning that at least some of them thought maybe they'd go down. It was showing the cork-style life jacket, which, as we've talked about, is not the greatest of life jackets. But he was wearing overalls, and I don't know if they ever found out who it was, but they did get footage of him. And this did not make families very happy, obviously. That same crew led another dive in 1995 to retrieve the Edmund Fitzgerald bell. This has been done in a few other shipwrecks, where they go down and replace the bell or put something in its place, and then bring up the bell for like a honorary thing. The Edmund Fitzgerald bell was replaced with a replica with all the names of the men who lost their lives, and the bell is now in a museum. I think it's in the Great Lakes Museum, and every year on the anniversary they ring it 29 times in honor of those who didn't make it off the ship. This ship is kind of like on the line between the US and Canada, but from what I can tell, Canada's kind of claimed the shipwreck, and I think the US is, I think it's just on that line enough that Canada's like it's on our side. Under the Ontario Heritage Act, activities on registered archaeological sites require a license. You have to get permission. If you go down there without that, you can get fined $1 million, and I think you can go to jail. There's even like, I think they updated it in 2006 or 2009 or something, where like you can't even get within like 1,500 feet of the shipwreck. Like you can't even like, unless you like are allowed or have a license or like special circumstances. Regardless of why it sank, the boat is now 530 feet below the surface in 2 pieces, and there was a legal settlement, as there usually is. Under maritime law, the ships are under their country's law, so like if a US ship sinks in England, the US still has to pay people. So because the ship is in Canadian waters, the US still has to pay for stuff. 2 widows of crewmen filed a $1.5 million lawsuit against the company that owned the ship, and a little while later, another $2.1 million lawsuit was added. The company then asked if they could limit their liability to about $800-ish thousand for this disaster, and they were like, we don't got that kind of money. Okay, sure you don't. The company paid compensation to the surviving families about 12 months before like a real investigation was put into finding out why the boat sank, and they were asked to sign confidentiality agreements. Many recommendations were put into place after the boat sank. In 1977, the Coast Guard started requiring the use of depth finders by all vessels of 1,600 gross registered tons and over. Since 1980, survival suits have been required aboard ship in each crew member's quarters and at their customary workstation with strobe lights affixed to life jackets and survival suits. A Lawrence C positioning system for navigation on the Great Lakes was implemented in 1980 and later replaced with Global Positioning System in the 1990s. Emergency position indicating radio beacons are installed in all Great Lakes vessels for immediate and accurate location in an event of a disaster. Navigational charts for northeastern Lake Superior were improved for accuracy and greater detail. NOAA revised its method for predicting wavelengths. The Coast Guard rescinded the 1973 Load Line Regulation Amendment that permitted reduced freeboard loadings. And the Coast Guard began the annual pre-November inspection program recommended by the NTSB. Coast Guard inspectors now board all U.S. ships during the fall to inspect hatch and vent closures and life-saving equipment. Since the shipwreck, almost every single year since then, the bell has been rung 29 times for the members who lost their lives. It has now, since 2023, I believe, been rung 30 times for Gordon Lightfoot, who wrote the Song of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which if you haven't heard it, you definitely should check it out. It's a well-known song and really brought this whole shipwreck to the forefront of people's minds. There are a few artifacts from the Edmund Fitzgerald in multiple museums in the area. The anchor that was lost in 1974, not even related to the sinking, was retrieved from the Detroit River and is located in the Dawson Great Lakes Museum in Detroit, Michigan. There are artifacts on display in the Steamship Valley Camp Museum in Sault City, Ste. Marie, including 2 lifeboats, photos, a movie of Edmund Fitzgerald, and commemorative models and paintings. And of course, there is the bell, which I believe is located in the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society building. These 3 ships were filled with men who were just trying to make a living. All 3 went down in November, which is the worst month to be on a boat in Great Lakes of the entire year. These storms on the Great Lakes are something I cannot even imagine, with waves up to 40 feet high if you're hit with a rogue one, but they can range usually from 25 to 30 feet high, with winds hurricane level. They're like little oceans, and Lake Superior is probably the worst of all of them because it is the biggest. These lakes are big, they are deep, and they are terrifying if you piss them off. The Carl D. Bradley sank in 1958 with 2 survivors. The Daniel J. Morales sunk in 1966, 8 years later with 1 survivor. The Edmund Fitzgerald went down 9 years after that with no survivors. Now, the other 2 boats, it was very clear from the survivor counts that the boat split on the surface. But because the Edmund Fitzgerald had no survivors, no one really knows what happened. Now, to me, I would assume that it broke on the surface because that seems to be a very common thing with this style of boat. Now, each of these boats were different, but they were Great Lakes cargo freighters, which are built very much the same shape. Their lengths were slightly different, but they were the same in a way. And just because this boat was built after 1948 does not mean that the metal didn't give way and it snapped on the surface. Because of the debris field, it's quite possible that it did just that. It snapped in half, one piece went down, and the other one went down just a little bit after, spilling out all its cargo everywhere. Now, I don't know what happened. I don't think we'll ever really know what happened because we don't have a first-hand account of what went down. The other 2 ships, we did, and even with the Carl D. Bradley, where he told everyone it split in half, they wouldn't believe him. Now, what makes me so angry about all 3 of these is the companies that owned these ships were doing their damn hardest to make it seem like it wasn't their fault. Now, obviously, can we say that all 3 of these ships were their fault? Fully. No. But they would try to be like, it was an act of God. It was the captain. You know, because they always have to blame someone. There's always like somebody they have to blame. And of course the company's going to be like, not us. Well, we're just these good people. No. I wanted to do this video mostly because all anyone's talking about, at least on TikTok, is the Edmund Fitzgerald, and no one is talking about the rest. Now, I only talked about 3. There are many, many more shipwrecks on these lakes that have claimed more, less, whatever, lives. But these 3 are very similar in how they broke up and just how they are generally, and I just thought it'd be interesting to kind of like just talk about them. I have a fascination with shipwrecks, so if you guys want to hear more shipwreck videos, just let me know. I didn't go in depth on any of these ships. I kind of just went over the basics of kind of what happened with all 3. If you want to know more in-depth documentary on these ships, I would highly recommend Big Old Boats and Part-Time Explorer. They are fantastic storytellers, let me tell you. I will link their channels down below and any other ones that I can think of. If you want an in-depth, in-your-face documentary on these ships, definitely check them out. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll be back again next week with another one. Alright guys, I'll see you later.